Hi, we're Mia and Emily. Today we'll be telling you about atolls and mesas. A mesa is a mountain or a hill with a flat top. Mesas are high landforms with steep sides. They are wide and flat too. The width of a mesa is larger than it is tall. Mesa in Spanish means table. Some Spanish explorers called it a mesa because they felt that the top of a mesa looked like the top of a table. Mesas formed by erosion of water. If the mesa is in a plain, desert, or another place where there is no water, then that place used to be an ocean years ago in the Pangea age where all the continents weren't divided yet. The water washes softer and smaller types of rock away. They take it from the top of the hill. The strong, firm, long-standing rock that stays on top of the mesa is called cap rock. Mesas are usually found in the American Southwest. Other places mesas are usually found is in dry regions where rock layers are horizontal. The largest mesa in the world is the Grand Mesa in the U.S. state of Colorado. Putting into account that the largest mesa in the world would have an area of about 1,300 square kilometers, 500 square miles, and goes on for 64 kilometers, 40 miles. Mesas can also be found in South Africa and Spain. One of our burning questions for mesas was, what is the difference between a mesa and a butte? We found out that a mesa is a confined hill or mountain with a level top. It also has steep sides where the area is smaller than a plateau, whereas a butte is slightly the same as it is also flat-topped. However, its area is smaller than a mesa's. The definition of mesas and buttes are quite various. A mesa has an exterior area of less than 4 square miles, 10 square kilometers, and a butte has an outer area of less than 11,250 square feet, 1,000 square meters. There are other theories though. For example, some sources plainly define a mesa landform as wider than it is high, but with a butte they say it's higher than it is wide. Humans affect mesas and table mountains by hiking on them, which is very popular in some places. You usually hike on the Atlantic side. There's one mesa called Castile Spruit, which overlooks Camps Bay, and the putt track is level route that is quite popular with walkers. Another way humans affect mesas or table mountains is by rock climbing. The main place you do climbs are located on the upper cable section. You are only allowed to do traditional climbing on mesas, table mountains. There are other activities you can do that do affect mesas and table mountains, but not always in a bad way. For example, caving and mountain biking. For caving, the most important caves are made of limestone, but there have been some cases of it being made in sandstone. Also, for mountain biking, the most popular route is the blockhouse route. An atoll is a ring-shaped coral reef including a coral rim that encircles a lagoon partially or completely. Atolls only occur in warm, tropical, and remote locations. For example, the Pacific Ocean is a popular place for atolls to be. It takes 30 million years to form an atoll. A typical atoll is ring-shaped and 5 to 20 miles across, but they can be smaller or larger as well. A lot of the reef is below the surface of the water, but usually around the rim there are a series of low flat islands called motus. The lagoon is shallow, maybe 100 feet deep or so. There are often patches of reef called bays strewn across it. Charles Darwin proved in 1842 that atolls usually happen when two things happen simultaneously. The two things are coral reef growth and the gradual sinking of an oceanic island. The process of it growing starts with a new tropical oceanic island made by tectonic plate collisions over oceanic hotspots of volcanoes. Then about 100,000 years later, a coral reef surrounds the island. Then new coral grows on top of the old coral and the island starts to sink. Over the next 25 million years, coral reefs turn into barrier reefs. This happens when the island sinks to just about sea level. The coral is still growing upwards, developing a lagoon, because of the growing coral reef in the island that's sinking. An atoll is then born 5 million years later when the island is completely underwater and the coral is still going upwards. Atolls are very beautiful and contain lots of pretty coral and marine life. The most famous atolls are the Coral Sea Islands, Tuamotu Archipelago, Chagos Archipelago, the Maldives in the Indian Ocean, the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands of the Pacific Ocean. There are many atolls around the world. Most atolls are found in the Pacific Ocean, with concentrations in the Tuamotu Islands, Caroline Islands, Marshall Islands, Coral Sea Islands, and the groups of Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Toklo. And the Indian Ocean, for example, the atolls of the Maldives, the Laccadive Islands, the Chagos Archipelago, and the Outer Sea Islands of Seychelles. Although some oceans like the Atlantic Ocean have no big groups of atolls, but there are a few small atolls in the east of Nicaragua. These atolls to the Colombian department of San Andres and the Provincia in the Caribbean Sea. The word atoll comes from an Indo-Aryan language that is spoken on the Maldive Islands. It is called Divehi. Atoll comes from atolhu, which is a word in Divehi. In 1675, it was first recorded in English as atolling. The definition of atoll is circular groups of coral islands. The word is synonymous with lagoon island. It has also been said as a ribbon-shaped reef surrounding a lagoon.
One of the questions we researched was what was the difference between coral reefs and atolls. After researching Charles Darwin's theory more, we came up with atolls are a type of coral reef and therefore not really any different. However, while atolls still remain coral reefs, they have freshwater lagoons in the middle and are usually ring-shaped. The typical coral reef, barrier reef, come in patches, usually surrounding an island. In all, Charles Darwin's theory of 3 types of coral reefs state that they are all under one category of landform, coral reef. Generally only have a slight differences through form and causation, and they mostly come off a fringing reef and evolve slowly.
This is some of the new reefs. Fringing reef, a reef system that grows fairly close to or directly from the shore with an entirely shallow lagoon or none at all. Barrier reef, a reef system that parallel the shore is separated from it by a wide lagoon that contains at least some deep portions. Atoll, a roughly circular, annular, oceanic reef system surrounding a central lagoon. The basic coral reef classification scheme described above was first proposed by Charles Darwin and is still widely used today. Darwin spent most of his coral reef explorations in the Indo-Pacific region and viewed the 3 types of coral reefs he described as simply different stages in the geological evolution of Pacific oceanic islands.
Darwin theorized that fringing reefs began to grow near the shorelines of new islands as the ecological conditions became ideal for hard coral growth. Then, as the island began to gradually subside into the sea, the coral was able to keep in pace in terms of growth and remained in place at the sea surface but farther from the shore. It was now a barrier reef. Eventually, the island disappeared below the sea surface, leaving only the ring of coral encircling the central lagoon, which means an atoll has formed. Darwin's general reef evolution theory was finally verified for Indo-Pacific reefs in the early 1950s, after analysis of the results of deep core drilling at Bikini and Entiwok Atolls, Marshall Islands.
However, it has also now become apparent that each of these 3 types of coral reef can, in some instances, also be formed by different processes as well. This is clearly the case with most of the relatively few true atolls that occur among Caribbean coral reefs.
Atolls are affected by different types of pollution. One of them is in the North Pacific Midway Atoll, a remote national wildlife refuge. There are many cases of plastic marine pollution that are quite evident. Other marine debris, also known, affect atolls such as lost or discarded fishing nets, known as ghost nets. Ghost nets cover over the emergent reef at the midway and get tangled up in coral heads. In the end, the nets rub against the coral heads until the animal and the coral dies. In travels to various coastal, atoll, and island communities, plastic pollution is a big problem for the atolls and the animals that live there.
One of our key coordinators with atolls was Miya's dad. He lived on the Marshall Islands for 1 month. We interviewed him on May 7th. And how big was the atoll?
The atoll that I was on Madro, maybe the longest strip of land was about 10 kilometers long, with one road going down the middle of it. There are some bigger ones, but most of them are smaller than that, I believe. And many of them, the whole ring may be quite large, but because it's broken up into chunks by the ocean cutting through, there's not contiguous land for much longer than that.
Did the atoll provide you with anything, and what was it?
Well, as I mentioned before, the atoll is really part of the ocean. It's just a little bit of land in the middle of the ocean. So there's a lot of really fresh fish. The locals were good fishermen and fisherwomen, and coconut trees grew well, so there were a lot of coconuts, and that's about it.
Our next question is, what was the temperature on the atoll, and how did seasons affect the atoll?
So the temperature was roughly similar to Singapore because it's not too far from the equator. It's in the northern hemisphere. Um, so therefore, also there weren't many seasons. I wasn't there for very long, so I didn't experience the change of seasons. But I was told that there's a wet season and a dry season. But the temperature doesn't vary a whole lot. Because it's such a small strip of land, the weather is pretty much the weather that's found on the ocean. So there's always a breeze and there's rain clouds that come and go and that kind of thing.
How was living on an atoll different than living on continents?
Well, for me, I think it's because it's such a small strip of land in a small community that everybody knows everybody else. As I mentioned, everybody was very friendly. And because of the geography, there was a lot of seafood and slightly different kinds of food than we get on the continent. So,
Did you enjoy living on an atoll and why?
yeah, I enjoyed the experience. It was very friendly people. It was a new experience, and I always like new experiences. New food, new culture, new customs. So yeah, I enjoyed it.
Which Marshall Island did you stay on?
Well, as I mentioned, there are many, many Marshall Islands. I just stayed on 3 of them. One called Majuro, which is the capital. Another called Kwajalein, which is the main military base for the Americans. And a small island called Ebi, E-B-E-Y-E, where most of the locals lived that provided service to the people of Kwajalein.
What was the percentage roughly of dead and alive coral on the atoll?
So coral, the whole atoll is made of coral that's above water. There's quite a bit of coral in the water, especially on the lagoon side. I didn't have time while I was there to actually go snorkeling and scuba diving, but I've been told by both locals and others who have visited that it's among the best scuba diving in the world. That there's a lot of live coral there. That all the damage that was done 50 years ago is now not affecting the coral. So I think there's a lot of live coral.
Can you tell me why you were on an atoll?
Sure. So in 1998, I was sent there as part of my training in medical training and residency to provide care for some of the Marshallese people who got radiation poisoning back in the 1950s when the Americans were conducting their tests. So the American government now pays for all medical care for anyone who was living at the time in the Marshall Islands. So that's why I was there.
Was the atoll polluted in any way?
Yes. The Republic of the Marshall Islands is a series of atolls. I don't know how many, but between 50 to 100 in the Pacific Ocean. And it was the site of a lot of battles between the Japanese and the Americans during World War II. And so a lot of plane wrecks and ships were sunk in the area. So there's some pollution in the sense that there's these sunken ships and planes in the lagoons and in the ocean around the atolls. But more importantly, after the end of World War II, the United States used the area of the Marshall Islands to conduct several nuclear bomb tests. In the Bikini Atoll, from which bikinis are named, they exploded several nuclear bombs. But what they didn't count on was that the wind blew the radiation over several of the atolls. And this had a big impact because it rained down and got into the soil and caused radiation pollution and radiation poisoning of not only the food but of the people. So some of the people that were living there got radiation sickness and radiation poisoning. So there was some pollution. Most of it has been cleaned up at this point. There are still a few islands or atolls in the area that people don't live on.
How does living on an atoll affect the community?
Well, being on an atoll, there's not a lot of land, and so they can't grow a lot of crops, and therefore they can't produce a lot of their own food. So they can't grow the community beyond its own food supply. So the community remains pretty small. They have to ship in most things from other countries to most goods and like I don't know, TVs or computers or even foodstuffs. Also, so that means living on an atoll keeps the community small. Another thing that living on an atoll does for the community is that they live on the ocean a lot. They get a lot of fish, so it's a ocean-facing community. And because it's not very high off the water, they have to be prepared for flooding. So the structures that they build, they need to build them in a way that if there's a big storm or a lot of rain and water comes up, that they can continue to survive.
My next question is, what does living on an atoll feel like?
Well, it feels you're pretty close to nature because you're so close to the water and it's really small.
What does an atoll look like?
Well, the atoll that I was on was a very long ring of coral and with a lagoon in the middle and an ocean on the outside. And the ring, it wasn't a contiguous strip of land, but there were breaks in the ring. So there was a strip of land with the lagoon on the inside, ocean on the outside, that would curve, and then it would stop. There would be just communication between the ocean and the lagoon. A little further down there would be another strip of the ring until it made an entire circuit. The land wasn't very high above the water. It was pretty flat, and it was pretty narrow. There was certain parts of the ring that were so narrow that if you stood in the middle, you could look to your left and you could see the ocean, you could look to your right and you could see the lagoon. Other bits of the ring were a bit fatter, where you couldn't see both sides at the same time. There were no mountains. Like I mentioned, it was not very tall. It was close to the water, and the plants were similar to plants that we see here in Singapore. There were some palm trees and low shrubs that you find near the equator and near the water.
Then he showed us the wave mat he got on the atolls.
So this is a wave map of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and it was used to train young navigators on how to take their sailing canoes from one atoll to another. Each shell on this wave map represents an atoll. Briefly was on Madro Atoll, which is here, and I also lived on Kwajalein Atoll, which is up here. And this whole area represents a very big part of the Pacific Ocean, probably as large as the country of Japan, let's say. Somewhere around there, I think. So hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, actually thousands of kilometers. And the way the wood bends around here shows how the waves would bend around the different atolls. Up here in the north, Bikini Atoll, this is the area where the nuclear testing was conducted. And it drifted south and actually covered some of the atolls and affected the people living there. So that's about all I know about the wave map.
There are a few remaining questions that we didn't get to,
So we displayed them through simulations and experiments.
This is the process. Our purpose is to see how long it takes for an island to sink completely.
We predict that it will take 4 rows of coral to make the sand sink all the way to represent the formation of an atoll.
The materials we will need are a pile of sand, a tub, a beaker of water, and some coral.
The whole process took 4 minutes and 54 seconds.
It took 3 rows of coral to make it an atoll, however we rearranged them.
It took 4 cups of water to make it an atoll.
First it started to roll, then it sank completely.
Before we generated waves, the island did not move.
Mesa simulation. Emily and Miya summative assessment. Purpose. Our purpose is to see how a mesa is formed.
Prediction. Our prediction is that all the soft rocks will come off as planned to show how a mesa is formed.
The materials we will need are a pile of sand, a beaker, 200 milliliters of water, a big flat bowl, and a desk.
Procedure. Step 1. Get the bowl and place it on the desk. Step 2. Put sand in the bowl. Step 3. Get the beaker and put 200 milliliters of water in it. Step 4. Pour 200 milliliters of water on the mound of sand until fully eroded. Step 5. Clean up.
Observations. You have to pour the water around the sand mound, otherwise it turned into slop.
The water carved it into a square. You directed the shaping.
It took only 31 seconds to complete compared to our atoll simulation, which took 4 minutes and 54 seconds.
All of the excess sand melted to the ground.